name's Bridger Fates, and welcome to Master Stockman Consulting's supplemental videos on ag research. You know, one of the biggest challenges for ag producers is understanding how, if, or when to implement ag research. We have 5 videos with 5 different research projects from right here in Utah. We'll describe the projects to you, and then we're going to work through the principles that you've learned in the Business Power Tools for Ag videos to be able to analyze these research projects to understand if, when, and how you should implement them. These videos are sponsored and funded through Western SARE, and we appreciate them for their funding. Now here's Brian Sebade to talk to us about the next research project.
So the project I'll be talking about today is looking at goats as an alternative for weed control on small acre ranchettes. Now this is an interesting project because in this situation we have a lot of different landowners, property owners that don't have large swaths of land, but yet we still have issues regarding invasive plants or plants that we really don't want to have on our property. This project specifically looks at Russian knapweed, which is a perennial invasive grass. It's considered noxious in many different places across the western United States. So with this, lots of times we're having to use a chemical control to make sure that we can get rid of this weed from different properties. The interesting part about this project is that we actually use goats to control this problem plant. And it also looks to see, do the goats actually benefit from eating this plant along with some other, invasive or unwanted weeds. So we look at that aspect with this project, but then also looking at, do people who own property, are they okay with having goats around? Are these goats, annoying? Are they problematic? What's interesting is most people enjoyed having the goats, and they seem like they would be a great alternative to many chemical options. It's important to note with this project that they actually only use meat goats, because if you use dairy goats, you can actually taint the milk with eating Russian knapweed. So keep that in mind if you're trying to use goats in a similar situation, that you want to stick with meat goats and not dairy goats. The conclusion to the study figured out that grazing this Russian knapweed plant for a certain amount of time during the growing season actually did decrease the amount of plants that were around on these small acreage properties. So that's great information to know that, hey, we can control this problem plant and we can have an alternative to chemical options, just because sometimes in these small acreage areas, we don't want to have these chemicals drift or move away from where they're applied and go onto a different property, killing either vegetable plants or horticulture plants, other things that we might be concerned with. The researchers also noted that while there were different challenges with this, perhaps using wire fence that is in the net was probably the best option for keeping the goats contained. While the goats did seem to have fairly good health and production as far as gaining weight, it is important to note that this may vary depending on where these goats are grazing and what species they have exactly. So as you think about this study, maybe think about how this can be applied to different situations. This can be applied to different weedy species, to different areas of land. Perhaps we can use goats instead of other livestock. In this particular instance, goats are way more tolerant of Russian knapweed than, say, other animals such as horses, which can actually be poisoned by consuming Russian knapweed. Now that you know a little bit more, we'll go into a roundtable discussion to talk about this project and some others in a little more in-depth.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that summary video of this project. Now we'd like to talk about how this project connects to the other tools and concepts that we've talked about in this video series of Business Power Tools for Agriculture. So with that, let's have Brian start us off.
Yeah, so if we think about the project that I was looking at, this is a really great way if you're thinking about getting started with a business venture, of basically looking at, am I looking to buy animals? Am I looking to lease animals? Am I looking to buy land or lease land, right? And so with this situation, it's really cool because, we have lots of different property owners that are willing to let you lease their land for grazing. As we've talked about, there's some benefits to the land through the different ways of managing these problem weeds with livestock. And so this is a really great way to think about that. Do I want to buy? Do I want to lease? And also, if we think about our passion, right? If you have a passion for goats, this is a great way to get started. You're not having to do it on a large swath of land and all those sorts of things. So so I think it's really great from that aspect. So, as we think about it, you probably want to be thinking about some good records for what you're doing. So, Hudson, do you have some great ideas for what we might think about for record keeping with this project?
Of course I do, Brian. We've talked lots of times and we're going to continue to talk. I think that one of the things that makes record keeping unique in agriculture is we're constantly trying to take our financial records and put them together with our production records, because production records is what we're really focused on. How much can we produce, how much can we sell for, and those type of things. And in this study, it really seems like there's several moving parts. So the first thing I think we really need to have a good handle on as far as records and what our numbers on is, what does it cost to treat those knapweeds with herbicide? And when we have that cost, then we can really compare to, and I really loved your comment, if you have a passion for goats, if this is something you would enjoy doing, then we can really take that, well, here we are putting out this chemical every year, it costs this amount of money, we have to do it every year, we're trying to control these weeds. Well, what if I started a business? What if I took this business of goat production, raising goats, and replaced that doing herbicide? So the second thing, after we have a good handle of what it costs to use the herbicide, is what is it going to cost us to start up this operation? And you mentioned it really good. Goats, fence, labor. We're going to want a really good understanding of how much that's going to cost us and how much that we're going to need. And then again, we're going to want a trend analysis for that on two things. What are our pastures trending towards? When we use these goats, are we trending to have less weeds, especially less knapweeds in these pastures? And are these pastures trending up to be better pastures, not just for the goats, but for the other livestock that we want grazing there? And then the last question, and this one's down the road, but I think there's lots of moving parts here, is can we run a viable goat production, a income center with these goats? Can we have them all year? Can we feed them all year? Can we sell the product from these goats and actually have money? Have a, what's it cost when you're a positive cash flow on that, right? If the goats are costing us more to have around than it does to spray the herbicide, well, after we use the tools and figure that out, maybe we wouldn't want that. But I love this study for all the moving parts and what we'd need to keep for production records.
Yeah, I think those would all be really great things to keep in mind. Going through that record keeping process would be really important with this, right?
Yes.
Making sure that what we're wanting to do is really penciling out. So that's great. So Wyatt, maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about some of the economic side of this as well.
Yeah, I think Hudson actually did a good job of touching on a few of these things, but really comparing your costs and benefits of maybe some more traditional methods like mowing and herbicides versus these goats. Also, whether or not you already own the goats or if you need to purchase the goats. Is fencing in place? Is it not in place? These are all kind of costs that may go into it that need to be considered, and will determine whether or not this is a viable solution as far as costs and whether or not you're going to make more money by using the goats to control the weeds versus the traditional methods. So really comparing those, maybe doing some economic evaluations on the two different methods and seeing which one's going to make more sense for that pasture or for the operation.
Okay, yeah, great. I think that's probably a good segue to talk about, Bridger, what would be some things we'd want to think about for an economic analysis, regarding this?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting project to think about as if you were starting into a venture like this. And it really depends in terms of which of those, which of the Wyoming Ranch tools you would use to make this sort of economic decision. Depends on where you're at in the process. So if you already owned a set of goats and you just had them, on a pasture and on your property, and you were looking at this as an opportunity to increase some income by going out and doing this custom grazing for folks that need some weed control, I think the partial budget would be a great tool. You would really just look at that partial budget and think about some of your increased costs by moving those goats around. So definitely you'd have some transportation costs, you'd have some additional fencing costs where you need to add in some electric fence and those sorts of things, and some labor cost of moving those goats around and getting them onto the weeds and controlling weeds for others. But then you would certainly also have an increased income category, where you were getting paid for that grazing instead of having to lease or rent pasture or pay for pasture. You're actually getting paid to graze your goats. So you can look at that in terms of that additional revenue. So the partial budget would really be comparing that additional revenue with those additional costs of fencing and transportation. Now, if you didn't own goats yet and you saw this as an opportunity to get started, you'd really have to also do a net present value analysis where you looked at the amount of investment it would take to buy a set of goats to go around and do this weed control, and how long would it take you to pay off that investment in the goats. Certainly one thing in terms of these investments that help when we're dealing with animals is we can sell the animal at the end, so you don't have to pay off all of the investment up front. You can recuperate some of that investment as you sell them as they get to the end of their useful life in the project. So I think that's the basics of how you would look at this one from those economic tools.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great. And I think really thinking about using those tools is really important. That can really help you out. So it's nice that we have those available. So some other things though, Bart and I want you to talk a little bit about, maybe the scientific process with this and, maybe about what's been done or, maybe what you would do, as you are a livestock manager in this venture.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think from the biological side, and looking at whether or not this would be an effective treatment, we'd really want to be looking at our experimental design. And so when we get to the basis of this, we're looking at, can goats be effective at controlling weeds? So we'd want to compare that treatment of goats foraging on weeds to other treatments, and including one of those treatments might be no control. So we might want to have several different plots where we are applying different treatments to these weeds. One of them might be no treatment, one of them might be using a herbicide, one of them might be mowing. And then, of course, for this project, we're going to want to have one where goats are being used to graze on those weeds. And because this is a treatment where we want to compare different treatments on similar weeds, we would want to look at tracts that were very close, tracts of land that were very close together, maybe within the same pasture, and we divide them up. So it might look like, plot A has no treatment, plot B has a treatment by spraying a herbicide, plot C has a treatment by mowing, and maybe plot D that's where your goats are. And you can even make it more complicated by having multiple plots getting, the same treatment, so that you have valid scientific analysis to look at the different treatments and their respective effectiveness on controlling the knapweed. So hopefully in this study, the goats grazing on the knapweed would be one that would be effective, especially for someone that was interested in owning and managing goats as a weed management tool.
Yeah, that'd be great. And like you say, the replication would be a little bit challenging perhaps, but
Yeah.
If you're doing this in a lot of different locations, maybe it would be easier than you think. So.
Hopefully you found this discussion helpful as we tied the project to the other tools and concepts that we've already talked about, and hopefully you'll watch the rest of the videos in this series.